anyone who's ever dealt with a bully knows that the biggest thing you don't do is appease them, because they will just ask for more and more. And we're talking about Donald Trump. We need to put Nigel Farage into this conversation as well.
This is our biggest single trading partner. Wouldn't it be devastating?
Well, I think it's more devastating if we don't consider our national security.
If you look at the number of countries that have imposed and then scrapped wealth taxes, Ireland, Austria, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Iceland, Luxembourg, Finland, Sweden, France, all did it and then decided to row back. Why do you think you can do it and nobody else has managed? If you were to be in the next government, what should voters expect from the Green Party?
I'm always aware of Jo Swinson, who of course was a Liberal Democrat leader, who said that she was going to be Prime Minister and promptly lost her seat.
Don't worry, you don't have one to lose yet.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that was a burn.
So Zack, welcome. Thanks very much for coming and speaking to us. Before we started recording, we were talking about this morning and Keir Starmer's press conference at Downing Street, that was Monday morning, in which he responded to Donald Trump's threats over imposing tariffs over various European nations' position on Greenland. What did you make of the press conference? And do you think we should consider retaliating through tariffs if they hit us with them?
Well, I think we're in serious danger. So since 2020 to 2024, 86% of UK arms imports have come from the United States. And we heard Keir Starmer say himself this morning in the press conference that our nuclear deterrent relies on a good relationship with Donald Trump. I think it's pretty worrying that we've allowed ourselves to become so reliant on American interests that a lot of this depends on if Donald Trump is in a good mood or not. We know this is an unpredictable man who I would say has behaved in ways that are unhinged at times. Yet just last week, we spent £260 million, the biggest defence deal ever, with Palantir. This is a US technology company who we also have links in with our National Health Service and health data. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is because I think Keir Starmer over and over again has put his eggs in the basket of being on the side of Donald Trump. But actually, I think we're becoming the weakest link in Europe standing up against Donald Trump.
So you talked about a £250 million defence deal there, but our total trade with the US last year was $330 billion. This is our biggest single trading partner. Wouldn't it be devastating to cut ourselves off or put ourselves at risk of being cut off by such a big partner?
Well, I think it's more devastating if we don't consider our national security. And the first role of any government is to make sure that they're keeping people safe. So we need to make sure that the people we're reliant on are reliable allies. And Donald Trump is certainly not that. In terms of trade, I think we should be looking at British manufacturing. We have a climate crisis. We know that we need to be pumping lots and lots of money into insulating homes, investing in renewables. And yes, of course, that's not just about being isolationist. You need to trade with other countries. But I think, again, it's an issue that we've allowed our trade to become so reliant on a country with such an unpredictable president. This speaks again to why leaving the European Union was such a disaster, both economically, culturally, and socially. And I do think it's time to be having conversations about rejoining the customs union. The Green Party been saying that for a long time. But actually, frankly, rejoining the European Union should not be off the table. Now, is that going to be easy? Absolutely not. We don't even know what Europe think about that. But I think we've certainly at a moment right now where we need to be having those conversations in sensible ways and looking at plausible options about what the future looks like. Finally, in terms of Donald Trump, we talked about retaliation. I do think, again, we should be reviewing US bases on UK soil and actually looking at a genuine strategic defence review. We know that the government's own intelligence chiefs put out a report last year that said the single biggest national security threat is actually the climate crisis. Yet in their own strategic defence review, I think it was mentioned twice or three times. We need to be really serious about the incoming crises that are facing us, including cybersecurity. And it feels so often these things just aren't part of the conversation.
But why does reviewing US bases on British soil have anything to do with cybersecurity or the climate crisis? I mean, you can still invest in things to tackle those threats, as you're talking about, but if you were to remove US bases from UK soil, you would surely undermine British security. We just saw the other day when British forces helped with US forces boarding a tanker, Russian tanker, which had been, we think, trying to break the oil embargo in Venezuela. The importance of being able to have that link between the UK and the US when dealing with threats such as Russia. I mean, surely if you do something like take US bases off of UK soil, A, you're going to trigger a backlash from this unpredictable president you mentioned, but B, that undermines our security for the long term.
Well, I think what's undermining our security right now is Donald Trump threatening Greenland.
More than Russia.
Well, it's a NATO ally, and Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all.
But do you see the US as a bigger security threat than Russia right now?
I don't think it's like getting into hyperbole of who is more of a security threat. I think it's about making sure we're protecting our own national security. I do think Donald Trump is dangerous. I think Vladimir Putin has clearly done more. But then we can talk about Donald Trump's complicity or active enabling with Netanyahu and the genocide in Gaza. None of these things are okay. And I think it's not about comparing things. It's about saying, how do we make sure that we're protecting British interests and working with allies? I think in terms of Greenland, we need to be really clear that Greenland's future is for the Greenlanders. And again, to see Donald Trump, of course, he's not talking about invasion yet, but he's talking about buying Greenland. Well, it's not for sale. And at some point, our country has to make a decision. Do we allow Donald Trump? Even to be fair to Donald Trump, he's not being coded about this. It's not like the mask is off. He's being very clear about exactly what he wants to do. He's been very clear for a very long time. And so again, to hear Keir Starmer this morning sounding like he still thinks he can convince him, it's the same language we heard when he offered him a second state visit. I was criticised at the time for saying I thought that was an outrageous thing to do. People said, do you not need a diplomatic relationship with the president? Of course you do. But there's a big difference between having a diplomatic relationship with a president that I wouldn't enjoy talking to and whose politics couldn't be much further than my own, to rolling out the red carpet and saying this is an ally that we're really proud of and we want to celebrate.
Yet Keir Starmer would argue that because of that relationship, he has managed to secure lower tariffs on UK exports than European countries have. He would also say that he's played a key role in getting the US on board with security guarantees for Ukraine, which are essential if they're going to move forward to a ceasefire in Ukraine. And without him and without that relationship, that may not have happened. Isn't he just being a pragmatist?
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think there's nothing more or nothing less pragmatic than relying on Donald Trump and assuming that these kind of short-term wins are going to maintain. We've already seen just in the last couple of days exactly what happens when Donald Trump doesn't get what he wants. Anyone who's ever dealt with a bully knows that the biggest thing you don't do is appease them, because they will just ask for more and more. And we're talking about Donald Trump. We need to put Nigel Farage into this conversation as well. This is a man that every time he says jump, Keir Starmer has said how high. And every time Keir Starmer goes to the right on an issue like immigration, we see Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson go even further right. Now, the reason why this matters is because Nigel Farage has not been able to condemn these actions either. He said at one point that it was less than acceptable to have someone who is so-called patriot not coming out right and condemning the fact that Donald Trump is going to put extremely punitive tariffs that threaten our national security.
Just for the sake of balance, we should say that Nigel Farage has just in the last hour or so come out and condemned the threat against the UK tariffs, saying that the UK national interest has to be first. Now, if we can just move on to NATO. Now, in the past, you've called our NATO policy out of date and suggested that in the age of Trump, NATO is now fully over. I mean, lots of people also have a similar view given the comments that the US president has made. But given all that's going on in the world currently, do you stand by that? Wouldn't unilateralism leave us isolated?
I stand by it even more than when I made the comments. I think I've been entirely vindicated at the time those comments were criticised. But what I was always saying was this wasn't a pro or anti-NATO position. It was an entirely pragmatic position, looking at what Donald Trump was saying, his threats to Greenland, and how much that was going to squeeze kind of the rest of those NATO countries. I think the real question is, what do you do about it? And I think we need to be talking to our NATO allies, including countries like Brazil and Mexico outside of NATO, and also building an alliance both with our European neighbours and with the global south. Ultimately, we need to make sure that the world is protected without the US.
With that, because I think in the past you've talked about building I think what you called a Eurocentric focused alliance centred on peace, which sounds to me, frankly, a bit like the EU. But would this alliance that you're talking about also be about peace? Because the point of NATO, of course, is it about collective defence. It's a nuclear-focused alliance about collective defence. And if you think the US is not really fully committed to that, is it a good idea to pull out entirely and then try and sign up to a new alliance that doesn't have defence at its core? Well,
a couple of things there. I don't think the phrase Eurocentric was ever mine, but I think it's a reasonable phrase in terms of, yes, it looks like the European Union, which is exactly why I want to talk about rejoining. I think more widely to your question, though, let's talk about nuclear. We've got the Trident missiles, which we know we've not had a successful test for in over a decade. We know are reliant on the US, exactly what the Prime Minister said this morning about needing the president. And I think to most people it'll strike us as extremely odd that for something that is a so-called deterrent, we would need to get permission from Donald Trump, hope he's in a good mood to allow us to do that, to protect our national security. I think the amount of money that we're wasting on Trident, we should actually be spending on the real threats to our country, which we've talked about already, being the climate crisis and cybersecurity, making sure we're building up resilience defences against flooding and wildfire. We know the climate crisis is not some distant threat. It's right here and right now, both in the global south, but also in the wildfires and floods we're seeing increasingly.
But even in this kind of new future that you depict, the US will still be the great world power, and you would still need to be able to talk to them as something akin to an equal. You give up the nuclear deterrent, and I take what you're saying, it is US built and US maintained. And whether we need to seek permission of the Americans before launching it, I don't think that's... I think, some people in government would say that's not the case. But still, the US would be the great big gorilla on the global stage. Giving up the nuclear deterrent surely then would put us as even more of a junior partner in that relationship.
Well, two things there. You're entirely right. We do need to talk to the United States. So this is not some kind of we need to cut off and never have conversations with them. We should all be adults and diplomats and work with people, whether we agree or disagree with them, no matter what country they're from, including those who engage in human rights abuses. We should be using our diplomatic leverage to keep talking to them, to try and get countries into a more moral position. I think the wider issue here, and this argument is well rehearsed by all sorts of people, but this idea of a nuclear deterrent, I don't think any sane person would ever use a nuclear weapon knowing that it would create a nuclear apocalypse. You would only use it as a return.
There are plenty of insane people out there. But...
Well, and it's quite true, and so that's very, very worrying. So then what it becomes, how do we've signed a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, we're just not taking our responsibilities seriously. Either when we signed that, we wanted to see a world without nuclear weapons, or we just signed it to be symbolic, which makes absolutely no sense. So then I think the question becomes, how do you get other people to denuclearize? Now, my position often gets satired by opponents where they say, I'm just going to ask Vladimir Putin nicely. That's absolutely not the strategy here. But the point here is if we're not willing to have conversations about peace and diplomacy, that part of those conversations look at everyone denuclearizing, then what are we doing here? Are we just rushing to the first country that has an insane leader that is willing to have a nuclear apocalypse? Or are we going to show the courage and actually step out there and say, we're living in a dangerous world and peace and diplomacy is a really, really difficult thing to work for. But there's nothing easier than just saying we'll spend more money on weapons and it's all going to be okay. It's not going to be okay, folks. The only way that we're going to maintain our world is if we start to have more sensible adult conversations that utilize diplomacy and try and get everyone around the table, including people we disagree with. Is that incredibly difficult? Yes. But being the leader of a political party or being the leader of a country should be an incredibly difficult thing to do because there's a lot to navigate.
Isn't the point, though, in the dangerous world in which we live, where Russia's menacing its neighbours, where China's looking at Taiwan, that you don't just need diplomacy, you need diplomacy and defence? And therefore, it's not a good moment to ditch your nuclear deterrent.
We definitely need diplomacy and defence. I think it's outrageous that we can have veterans sleeping on the streets. I think it's outrageous that there are some interventions we've got involved with where our military are not armed properly and we're sending people essentially to die if we're not giving them the weapons they need to defend themselves. I think all of that needs investment, and we need to be listening to the people calling for that investment. We come straight back to the point that if we have a nuclear weapon that doesn't even work when we're testing it and is reliant on the US, we don't in any real terms have a nuclear deterrent.
How much would you spend on defence? This government obviously has an ambition to hit 3%, I think, on defence spending of GDP in the next parliament, 5% by 2035. What's your view?
So that comes back to what I started this interview with. 86% of our UK imports come from the United States. So it's not surprising that when Donald Trump is pushing us to go to 5% for NATO spending, he's looking to make more money in the United States. This is alongside the action that we've seen in Venezuela, where he abducted Nicolas Maduro. And we know he's been very open. That's about oil and gas. And all of these things are intrinsically linked. So it's very difficult to give you a number when we've not got a costing manifesto yet.
Should it be more or less than we are now? Do we spend too much on defence at the moment?
No, I think it depends on exactly what's happening in the world at the time and what you're defending yourself from.
But at the moment, looking at, Pippa was just talking about the threats from Russia, what China is doing in the South China Sea. We obviously see a fairly destabilised position in the Middle East. Are we spending enough on defence right now?
At the moment, we should be reprioritising the money we're putting into things like Trident and actually putting that into our own national security, including cybersecurity and the climate crisis.
So we're spending enough, we just need to change what we're spending on?
Well, again, it depends how you define it, because we're clearly not spending enough on tackling the climate crisis. And people like Emma Howard-Boyd, who ran an independent review into London's climate adaptation, has been very clear over and over again that we're not moving fast enough. None of that will happen until we take it seriously and we put investment into it. Now, it can sound like you're answering a different question, but as soon as you take the fact that the risk of the climate crisis is a national security issue in terms of risks of civil unrest because of lack of resources, risks of flooding and wildfire, then you go, actually, that's the number one national security risk. And actually, that's what we should be putting money into rather than military interventions around the world.
OK, but on military interventions, there is still a lot of very live threats out there. And you have said that you think part of the solution would be working closer with European allies. You've also said that you want a closer relationship more generally with the European Union, and we'll come on to that a little bit more detail in a moment. But isn't it a bit hypocritical to be, on the one hand, pushing for closer EU allegiance, but not recognising that some of those EU members, so countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, are on the front line when it comes to the Russia threat? And whatever you might think about sitting down with Vladimir Putin and being prepared to have a conversation with you, and a lot of people would like you to try, or like Britain to try, the reality is that the only threat he seems to listen to at the moment is a military one.
I mean, Putin is a vile dictator, and we need to be really clear about that. But those countries that you named are some of the same countries who are calling for a European security alliance, because they can see increasingly that NATO isn't working and that countries in Europe are far too reliant on Donald Trump, who is often siding with Vladimir Putin. So I think what you're asking me is completely coherent with everything I'm saying. We need to work with our European neighbours. I think the next question where I don't have a particular answer to is some of those European countries are problematic. They have leaders on the right or the far right that I would find it very hard to work with, who have wanted to see the breakup of Europe because they've been more comfortable with Vladimir Putin as an ally rather than other European countries. So again, I don't think there's easy or simple answers here, but I think you need to work on basic principles. And the fact that Putin wanted us to Brexit, Nigel Farage wanted us to Brexit, we've been left in a much more isolated place, where the entire context of this conversation means that we are now almost desperate for a friend. And so the question becomes, do you make Donald Trump your friend, which seems to be the route that Keir Starmer's gone down, and I'd say it's not going particularly well, and I think it's going to get worse, or do you actually go, let's relook at what we left that was working better and look at how we can influence Europe from within?
So what Keir Starmer says repeatedly, and we challenge him on this all the time, is that actually it's not an either-or choice. It's about having a good relationship with the US, but also having one with the European Union. And he has, over time, pushed for closer trading links, wants to go further. I think we've reported on this in recent weeks as well. Where do you think the UK needs to end up when it comes to its relationship with the European Union, and what's realistic this side of an election?
Yeah, first of all, I think what Keir Starmer's saying there is fair enough, and sometimes we can all get caught into giving a false binary, and I think that answer is legitimate. In an ideal world, I would like us to maintain a relationship with the United States where Donald Trump was doing what we wanted him to do and not behaving in unpredictable ways, and we had a better relationship with Europe. I do think, though, it seems pretty unrealistic, though, with the president that we've got at the moment. We could argue it's been unrealistic for decades because of US imperialism, but let's talk about today. I think with Donald Trump, it's problematic. In terms of what I'd like to see with Europe, I don't think there's any point in beating around the bush. I'd like to see us back in the European Union. I'd like to believe that's where our heart is. I don't do that with kind of doughy eyes. I think there's lots of issues with the European Union. There's always been lots of issues, and I think some of those issues have got worse. I think ultimately, though, we're better within it, influencing it from within rather than without. Now, someone will say, how can you say that about the European Union but not say that about NATO? Like, aren't we better in NATO influencing it within? But I come back to my original point. Donald Trump has so much domination within NATO that I don't believe it's possible to reform NATO from within. I should say that Green Party policy is to reform NATO from within and to stop it being a nuclear-first alliance. If we can do that, I'll be the first to celebrate it. But I think the world has increasingly changed so quickly that it is time to start looking at Europe.
Can I just, that kind of makes me think of something slightly on a tangent, but it's really interesting. If you were to be in the next government, in whatever role, what should voters expect from the Green Party? Should they expect what you, Zack Polanski, want, and for you to be pushing that from within government? Or should they expect for you to be pushing hard on whatever the Green Party has decided collectively, because it makes decisions in a more collective way than most parties
Absolutely.
do, should they expect you to be pushing those policies instead? And you've just mentioned one place where those two diverge. So what should we expect?
I'll answer your question very directly, but I also want to, I'm always aware of Jo Swinson, who of course was a Liberal Democrat leader who said that she was going to be Prime Minister and promptly lost her seat. So right now...
Don't worry, you don't have one to lose yet.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that was a burn. Right now, though, my focus really is on winning as many Green MPs as possible across the country, and I think questions about government or King's speeches are actually questions for future years. But so I'm not boring. I will answer your question, but I want to put that caveat in there. Ultimately, Green Party members decide Green Party policy, which is exactly why when I said this is my position, I also made sure that I stated the Green Party position. If we're in Parliament, the people we would really be answerable to are our constituents. Now, some of those constituents may be Green Party members and they've been part of deciding Green Party policy, but ultimately we're always really clear that the people who elect the MPs are their local residents. That doesn't mean they don't have Green Party values. In fact, quite the opposite. They campaign and they are elected on a Green Party manifesto. That is ultimately the contract between them, the party, and the constituents. So I think that's kind of the double lock to make sure that there's trust and value there. If people are unhappy with their MP, of course, there's always another general election coming, and I think that's the accountability mechanism.
So obviously, a lot of people would say the EU might not actually want us back, but say they did.
Right.
If you post-election were in a position where perhaps a Labour Party had the highest number of seats but wasn't able to form a government, for example, I mean, there's various different ways this could work. Would you make rejoining the European Union or starting the process of rejoining the European Union a condition, a red line of working with them?
So again, the first boring part of the answer is that would be a decision made by members and a conversation made by members. To give you my answer today, I think my red lines would much more be things around the cost of living crisis. So things like a wealth tax to make sure that we're redistributing wealth from multimillionaires and billionaires around our economy. Things like nationalising the water companies. It's outrageous that water companies are pumping sewage into our water and charging us extra for the privilege. Really want to make sure we have a conversation about the climate crisis with any kind of government conversations. And then, of course, proportional representation. It is outrageous that people's votes don't match equally. The Green Party have demonstrated we can and we do win under first past the post. So this isn't about changing it for narrow political means, but it's about saying we can't have a sustainable democracy until we end this culture of safe seats. And a lot of this culture from safe seats comes from a broken voting system.
Would you, though, be willing, or think the Green Party would be willing to do a deal with Labour or the Lib Dems in order to keep out a reformed government? A progressive deal, if you like.
Potentially, but it's very difficult to answer a hypothetical question. I think it would depend on who the leader of the Labour Party is, what they're offering, and indeed who the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
And in fact, you said that you wouldn't do a deal with Keir Starmer, you wouldn't work with Keir Starmer. Why single him out? I mean, is there anybody else in the Labour Party that you would rule out ever working with?
Yeah, so the reason I singled out Keir Starmer, because obviously politicians are always told, don't get into hypothetical questions, don't rule things out. But actually my whole kind of political identity is around bold politics and saying what I think. And Keir Starmer is a man that spent a long time before he slashed the two-child benefit cap, which was keeping hundreds of thousands of children in poverty. We were campaigning for that for a long time and he refused to budge. He eventually got there, but only because of Green MPs and the backbench rebellion. Same with slashing disability cuts. He was going to do it, but it required Labour MPs and Green MPs to come together along with other people to say, don't do that. And then, of course, the genocide in Gaza. And I think there just comes a point where you've said enough about a Prime Minister and seen enough that you go, actually, there is no possible scenario where I believe that I could work with Keir Starmer and trust him, because I think he's so fundamentally broken that trust between him and the public. And I think once that's broken, you can never get it back.
Zach, we wanted to ask you about some of your economic policies. You were talking about a wealth tax. I'm really interested in this idea, partly because it's something that Labour members and supporters and voters, very much want and push for. And for one reason or another, they haven't necessarily got what they want. I think you've said there's very little evidence that people would be leaving the country after you impose wealth tax. But actually, it's not quite the case, is it? There's quite a lot of evidence that wealth taxes in other countries have caused people to leave the country. So, for example, in Norway, record numbers of super-rich Norwegians now abandoning Norway because the centre-left government there increased wealth taxes to 1.1%. The same was true in France before they scrapped theirs. There are German estimates that suggest that there would be quite a lot of movement away, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of wealth being lost every year. If you look at the number of countries that have imposed and then scrapped wealth taxes. Ireland, Austria, Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Iceland, Luxembourg, Finland, Sweden, France, all did it and then decided to row back. Why do you think you can do it and nobody else has managed?
It's a good try, Kiran, but everyone knows that if you're a multimillionaire and billionaire and you're taxed 1% on assets of £10 million or more, or 10% on assets of £1 billion or more, if you say you're going to leave, then that's just absolutely ludicrous. We're talking about 1%. Now, to answer your question...
But people do leave, right?
Well, no, because there's plenty of countries where it has worked. Switzerland, they place with famously lots of wealthy people. Some of the examples you gave me were where the thresholds weren't right. So the answer then is let's make sure we get the thresholds right. Sometimes people felt like they were being taxed too much and that they couldn't maintain that asset. But what I'm very specifically talking about is a wealth tax on assets of 1% on £10 million or more, or 2% on £1 billion or more. It's also important to say when we talk about a wealth tax, what we're really talking about is wealth taxes. So we need to do things like bring capital gains tax in line with income tax. The reason why that's important is right now we tax earned income more than we tax unproductive wealth. So that means if you're working with your hands or with your mouth or whatever you might be doing during the day, you are getting taxed more than someone who might make more money than they sleep, than some people can earn in a lifetime. That's fundamentally unfair, and we've got to fix that. And then just finally on a wealth tax, to bring things like national insurance on investment income. Again, it just seems unfair to people that they can have an investment and hoard wealth, and that just keeps accruing more and more money. The only way we're going to have a more productive economy is to make sure that we're essentially stopping those blockers and making sure we get more money moving around our economy.
I mean, you say it's absurd, but it's not absurd, because wealthy people will move to take advantage. They're very mobile. They will move to take advantage, even if you think it's a small amount of their total proportion of their wealth. They will move to take advantage.
Can I clarify? I think it's absurd to worry about it. If someone is a billionaire and they don't want to pay 1% of tax in this country to invest in our healthcare system or education system or policing, whatever it might be, I think we should wave them out the door. I think we should be more patriotic about that and say if people want to live here, then actually they should want to pay their taxes.
But it's not just about patriotism, it's about whether the numbers add up, right? So it doesn't matter whether you kind of feel patriotic about this. If the numbers don't add up, it's not really worth doing.
I think it does matter, though. I think we've got to be more than just self-interested economic machines. That's a kind of hangover from Thatcher and Reagan. I think we need to go, what kind of society do we want to be? We should have a politics of care. And a politics of care can only happen if we say it's just not right that 50 families in this country own more wealth than 34 million people. 50 families versus 34 million people. It's just not sustainable and not coherent to say anything, but we need to tax the rich.
So you would do it even if it didn't raise much money?
It's not so much about raising money, it's about tackling inequality. Sure, it will raise revenue, obviously, if you tax people. But the point is, if you continue to allow people to hoard assets, that removes other assets for other people. And we see this as the difference between renting and profiting. We know that ultimately a very, very small group of people, including people who own the media in this country, are profiting in huge amounts of ways by just holding these assets. What then is doing is when they can't buy any more assets, they're buying our democracy. And so democracy is at stake here. Our literal kind of existential society in terms of the way that we recognize things will only work if we start to tax the rich and we remove the deep inequality that's rooted throughout our society.
Can I ask you one very specific one, very quick one? The government has brought in something of a wealth tax in the last budget because it is now bringing in a surcharge on council tax for properties worth £2 million or over. Would you change that threshold?
I think we need to scrap council tax entirely. I think one of the things that is almost cross-party is everyone agrees that council tax just does not work and is unfair. No one's been brave enough to have a bold vision about what that looks like. I think there needs to be conversations about a land value tax, for instance.
With the principle that people sitting in larger, more expensive houses should be paying more.
Yes.
Including in central London.
Yes.
Just one last one on the economy. You've made it quite clear you're not a fan of Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, and suggested previously that a Green government would borrow more. How much more would you borrow, given currently £1 in every 10 that the government spends of our money goes on repaying debt interest?
Well, there's an old Keynesian phrase that anything you can do, you can afford. And what that means is ultimately, rather than talking about borrowing, we need to have a proper conversation about investment. If you are borrowing to invest, you'll ultimately have a spending multiplier. So if you're spending on schools or you're spending on the healthcare system, that ultimately brings money back to the economy that pays it for itself. If you do what Liz Truss was doing and you borrow to fund unfunded tax cuts, then that's clearly going to be very bad for the economy. So it's not a question about how much do we borrow. I think the question is, what do we want to invest in? I've been really drawn by the work recently of Mariana Mazzucato, who obviously talked about the missions with Keir Starmer. But the mission he seems to have put is a mission for economic growth. that's not really a mission. Economic growth is what happens when you take a mission maybe to reduce inequality or a mission to tackle the climate crisis. I think we need to get much more specific about what kind of economy we want.
But these are very long-term ideas,
yes.
And investing takes time to produce results. In the short term, we are spending billions and billions and billions of pounds on debt interest every year, the money that could be going elsewhere. Should the government not be trying to reduce that at the same time?
I think it's very good to reduce the deficit and to reduce the debt, but only good if you're doing it by making sure you're investing. I don't think we just want to be bean counters or just worrying about accountancy. I think we ultimately want to go when people are not able to get a hospital appointment or people can't see a dentist, then that's not the kind of economy we want to live in. I think you've got to start with the good society, the caring society. How do you build it? Then you work out how you can afford it. But anything we can do, we can afford.
Now, Zack, you've been very generous with your time, but we do have a few quick-fire questions for you.
These are always the scary ones.
Which you can answer as lengthily or as quickly as you like. So the first one, I'll kick off. Should we ban social media for under 16s? Topical at the moment.
I'm really torn on this. And actually, I've just seen a briefing this morning from the NSPCC who are saying that we shouldn't. And I think when the NSPCC are saying something, we should be listening carefully. So it's one of those issues where I'm still listening to people. I'm still very much garnering my views on it. One thing, though, without avoiding the question, but I think it's parallel to it and almost more important, is addictive algorithms. Less about banning it for 16-year-olds, but actually saying for both younger people and for adults, we're so often on our phones. And actually, it's outrageous that technology companies are allowed to keep making addictive algorithms. So in the same way that we talk about gambling or alcohol, I think we should take a public health approach to this, which is about making sure we're protecting people's mental health.
Now, I know you want to add in the context, but these are yes or no questions.
Okay.
We're going to be very strict from now on, Kiran.
Should MPs still be using X?
Again, there's context.
You're not very good at this.
I want Keir Starmer and the government to come off X. And I think as soon as they do that, then there's no reason for an MP to be on X. Even sidestepping the question, I'm still on X. And I find that really, really difficult because I really don't want to be there. At the same time, though, it's important that I see what the government's putting out there. And it's important I'm able to hold them accountable online. So I'd like Keir Starmer and the whole government to make a collective decision that we're all coming off X and going on Blue Sky, for instance. And I'd be the first to get off it as soon as they made that decision.
Next one, Jeremy Corbyn or Zara Sultana?
I'm definitely going to pass on that and say the Green Party.
But if you had to do a deal with one of them, I mean, Zara's not been very nice about you, has she?
I think both of them have been pretty nice about me, actually, and I've been nice about them. It's been pretty collegiate, but actually now we've got 180,000 members and we're hitting 19% in the polls. I think the argument is if you want environmental, social, racial and economic justice, then join the Green Party.
Would you introduce a sugar tax?
Again, complicated. It depends on the thresholds of it. But I think whatever's done should be led by medical health professionals and experts in the field and not just by politicians.
And the last one
I promise I'll quickfire this.
Actually, this one would be interesting for a slightly longer answer,
Okay.
but up to you. Is Britain broken?
Yes, fundamentally broken. And that's almost every sector that you look at. Again, we have water companies that are owned by foreign investors that are breaking our country, both in terms of the pollution that they're causing, but also the deep ruptures that they're causing for our democracy. We were talking about economic growth and GDP. We've got into this system where if you're a water company that pollutes, that doesn't subtract from GDP, but the person who comes along and cleans it, that's good for GDP. So I think the country's broken because of the measures and criteria that we've used over 14 years of conservative austerity and before that, to be fair, and that Labour seem to be continuing on. Our country is broken, but that doesn't mean we can't be great again, or it doesn't mean we can't be beautiful. It doesn't mean we can't be together. I think fundamentally British people are kind and they're compassionate, and I know that they want a better country. And I think the way that we make hope normal again is to remove the old politics, to stop the old way of doing things. There's this kind of insidious idea that we can't be imaginative, or the ideas that I'm suggesting and the Green Party is suggesting are too simple and too easy. Actually, nothing I'm saying is easy, but it is quite simple, because I think when you see why this country is broken and you see the vested interests, you know that you can't do anything until you take on those vested interests. That's exactly what I intend to keep doing.
Zack Polanski, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming.